I earned my degree online at Arizona State University. I chose to get my degree at ASU because I knew that I'd get a quality education, they were recognized for excellence, and that I would be prepared for the workforce upon graduating. To be associated with ASU, both as a student and alum, it makes me extremely proud, and having experienced the program, I know now that I'm set up for success. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.
This message comes from Capital One. The Capital One Venture X Business Card has no preset spending limit, so the card's purchasing power can adapt to meet business needs. Plus, the card earns unlimited double miles on every purchase, so the more a business spends, the more miles earned. And when traveling, the Venture X Business Card grants access to over 1,000 airport lounges. The Venture X Business Card. What's in your wallet? Terms and conditions apply. Find out more at CapitalOne.com/VentureXBusiness.
Hello, and welcome to this throwback episode of Our Fake History. My name's Sebastian Major, and as many of you know, right now I'm taking a short break from releasing new episodes. But have no fear, we are about to return for Season 9 in just 2 weeks. So the next time you check your feed, there will be an all-new episode of Our Fake History waiting for you. So stay on top of that. Today, I'm throwing you back to Season 2, Episode number 43, What is Phantom Time? Now, I've had a lot of fun revisiting this episode, because the Phantom Time hypothesis and Anatoly Fomenko's new chronology still kind of break my brain. These are the types of theories that not only challenge our perception of history, but also any sense of objective reality. The claim that hundreds, and in the case of the new chronology, thousands of years of human history never actually occurred and were simply invented by unscrupulous historians can be genuinely destabilizing. So, in this episode, you'll hear me get a little more philosophical and speak explicitly about how I define the concept of historical truth. Now, I think it's important to ask, how do we know if something truly happened in the past? And I believe that the lazy answer is that we can't really know. And sure, while I generally understand that sentiment, I think it can be dangerous to fully embrace that way of thinking. The bonkers theories that I look at in this episode are able to thrive because truth is such a slippery concept. In this episode, I felt like it was important to make a clear case for there being some form of objective truth that can be discovered and understood. And in a way, I think that really dates this episode to 2017. I think the zeitgeist at the time had me especially paranoid that we were losing our grip on anything that could be called the truth. So you'll hear me in 2017 making my case for historical facts. Now, in this episode, I throw around quite a few dates. And as many long-time listeners know, I still use the BC AD qualifiers for my dates, as opposed to the BCE and CE qualifiers that are often used. Now, I've explained why I do this before on the show, but in case you missed those episodes and are curious why I stubbornly cling to what many see as an outmoded way of reckoning time, well, allow me to explain. As many of you know, the BC AD system is a specifically Christian way of organizing human history. BC stands for before Christ, and we count down, confusingly, from the earliest possible dates to the presumed date of the birth of Jesus. Then begins the AD section of history, standing for the Latin Anno Domini, or in the year of our Lord, and then we start counting upwards. Now, I don't use the BC AD system because I'm particularly religious. I'm not. Nor do I use it because I think it's a particularly useful way to organize human history. It really isn't. But the BCE CE designations are even worse, in my opinion. Here's why I think that. BCE stands for Before Common Era, and CE stands for Common Era. But in this system, we still use the birth of Jesus to demarcate these two sections of history. The birth of Jesus didn't start a common era. What are we doing here? What is this? I don't like it. Now, I understand that the BCE CE designations were adopted to take the explicitly religious language out of our dating system. And I generally agree with the spirit of that change. However, it seems a little ridiculous to me that we've changed the explicitly religious language but kept the explicitly religious dating system. That always struck me as a cowardly half measure. If we're gonna have a religious dating system, let's just call it what it is. But if we're going to divorce our current dating system from Christianity, and I don't think that's a bad idea, then let's go whole hog and completely rethink what year it should actually be. Personally, I've always been partial to something called the Holocene calendar. That's where we start our dating system with the onset of the geologic era known as the Holocene. The start of the Holocene also aligns roughly with the Neolithic Revolution, when human beings first started developing settled agriculture, and also generally corresponds to the building of the earliest known megalithic structures in places like Göbekli Tepe. Now, the beauty of the Holocene calendar is that the proposal is that we simply add 10,000 years to our current date. So instead of it being 2023 AD or CE, it would be 12,023 HE. HE standing for both Holocene era and Human era. The thinking is that this style of dating emphasizes just how old human civilization actually is. As a species, we have roughly 12,000 years of settled agriculture and megalithic construction in our past. The HE date gives us a much clearer picture of just how deep our history truly is. Now, I will admit, this system is not perfect. You could quibble with the fact that there isn't a nice, clear event that demarcates year one in this calendar. The 10,000 extra years just gets us in the vicinity of the start of the Holocene and the Neolithic Revolution. And while those former AD or CE dates transpose quite nicely into this new system, for instance, Columbus's first voyage becomes 11,492 HE. America's Declaration of Independence becomes 11,776 HE. The former BC dates are radically different. For instance, you might know that Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC. Well, that date would become 9,956 HE. So, I'll admit, for students of the ancient past, adapting to the Holocene calendar would kind of be a pain in the butt. But even with those criticisms considered, I still like the Holocene calendar. I also think it helps put the claims of the new chronology, which we talk about in this episode, in better context. As you'll hear, Anatoly Fomenko claims that there are only 1,300 years of real history in our past. the Holocene calendar helps demonstrate what a truly grandiose claim that actually is. The Holocene calendar reminds us that there's evidence that we've been living in large groups and building complex structures for 12,000 years. Denying the existence of those many thousands of years might be a tougher sell for Anatoly Fomenko if our dating system put those years on the marquee. Now, I think this episode also pairs nicely with our last throwback episode on Olga of Kiev. What is the thematic through line between these two episodes? Well, I leave that for you to figure out. You're smart. You'll get it. I actually think it's pretty obvious, but you can do that work for yourself. Okay, without further ado, episode number 43, What is Phantom Time?
On Christmas Day, in the year 800 AD, the Frankish king Charlemagne found himself in the city of Rome. He had been summoned by Pope Leo III, who had found himself made a prisoner in his own city. The Romans had grown tired of their adulterous and unpious pope, and had planned to punish him by poking out one of his eyes and tearing out his tongue. The Holy Pontiff was rapidly losing his legitimacy, and he needed help. Well, that help came in from one of the most powerful kings in Europe, Charles the Great, aka Charlemagne. In November of that year, Charlemagne had arrived in Rome and had established some much-needed order, and then he proceeded to help Leo restore his tarnished reputation. The Pope was pretty deeply indebted to old Charlemagne. So on Christmas Day, as the king knelt before the altar in St. Peter's, saying his prayers during Christmas Mass, the sneaky Pope Leo III tiptoed up behind him and placed an imperial crown on the king's head. The Pope then knelt down and anointed the feet of the king. When Charlemagne arose, the Pope declared that he was no longer just king of the Franks, he was now the emperor of the Romans. According to the Pope, he was now the rightful successor to the title that dated back to Augustus Caesar himself. This was the birth of the so-called Holy Roman Empire. Now, Charlemagne's chroniclers, who tell us this story, go to great pains to explain how surprised the king was. He was all, "What? Who, me?" when the Pope slipped the crown on his head. They would have us believe that Charlemagne was completely unaware of the honor that was about to be bestowed upon him. The whole thing had just been a big surprise, but of course he felt obligated to accept this new fancy title. Now, most modern historians are very skeptical of this story. Many find it hard to believe that Charlemagne would have let something with such huge political and cultural ramifications happen by surprise. Most argue that this was just a piece of political theater that had been orchestrated by Charlemagne and the Pope ahead of time. Then, there are some who suggest that this didn't happen at all, and the chroniclers just made this story up after the fact. But then there's some who go quite a bit further. Not only do they doubt the truth of this one story, they doubt the truth of the whole Charlemagne story in general. Yes, there are some who think that Charlemagne never actually existed. His entire reign was just a fictional creation. Some theorists have gone so far as to suggest that huge amounts of fake history have been inserted into the historical record. This has inflated our typical chronology with something they call phantom time. Could it be that hundreds of years of our history never actually occurred? Is it possible that everything we know about the ancient and medieval periods comes from an elaborate forgery? This week, the title of the podcast seems just a little too on the nose. This is our fake history. Episode number 43. What is Phantom Time? Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast that looks at historical myths and tries to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story that it simply must be told. This week, we are diving into two of the strangest historical theories that I have ever encountered. They also have two of the coolest names in all of fringe thinking: the Phantom Time hypothesis and the new chronology. Now, I'm addressing these two theories in the same episode because they're both linked by the same incredible premise. That is, that hundreds, and in the case of the new chronology, thousands of years of human history never actually occurred. Each of these theories makes the case that early modern historians invented huge swaths of human history. And when they say invented, they mean like they literally made it up from nothing. They fabricated events, people, conflicts, basically all the stuff that constitutes what we think of as history. In a way, these are the ultimate fake history theories, in that they claim that most of our history is, well, fake. Now, how and why these evil historians managed to fabricate huge parts of the past varies between the theories. But what draws people to both the Phantom Timeline and the new chronology is the fact that they both so radically disrupt not only our perception of history, but our perception of reality itself. These theories call into question the very idea of historical truth. Now, in a way, this is one of the oldest debates in philosophy. Can anything be said to be objectively true, or is there only subjective experience? Now, that is a big, fat philosophical question if there ever was one, and I in no way plan on answering it in this humble podcast. But in a weird way, this has become one of the most pressing questions of our time. Some have cynically suggested that we are living in a quote-unquote post-fact world, where real reporting and propaganda mix so easily in our media and online that discerning the truth of an event becomes nearly impossible. This process is often magnified when it comes to our past. For example, in 2015, a certain real estate mogul and golf course owner was called out by historians for placing a plaque on his golf course in Virginia that said, quote, "Many great American soldiers, both of the North and the South, died at this spot. The casualties were so great that the water would turn red and thus became known as the River of Blood. It's my great honor to have preserved this important section of the Potomac River." End quote. The historians pointed out that there was no evidence that there had ever been a battle anywhere near the site of this golf course. But when questioned about this by journalists, the outspoken New Yorker who owned the golf course fired back at historians, saying, quote, "How would they know that? Were they even there?" End quote. This is an example of a misconception that many of my younger students have about history. That if you weren't there to witness something firsthand, then there's no way to know if it happened or not. This is the same misconception that the fringe theories we're going to explore today try and exploit. Oftentimes, history can feel just like a fictional story. So, who's to say that the people writing it just didn't make things up? It's a tempting conspiracy to entertain. What if our entire past was just an elaborate fable? What if the foundation of our entire society was built on sand? Indeed, the entire premise of this podcast stems from the idea that sometimes myths and misconceptions get folded into the historical record and become what we think of as quote-unquote real history. However, the other central idea that grounds this show is that by thinking critically and digging into the evidence, we can separate the fact from the fiction. Or at the very least, we can make good guesses that are supported by evidence. So I should lay my biases on the table right here. Well, I believe that it is natural and appropriate for history to be revised as new sources are discovered and new lenses of interpretation are developed. I also believe that there are such things as historical facts. If there's an abundance of physical and documentary evidence that an event took place, then I am totally comfortable saying that that event took place. Like, for real. Now, I'm sure some of you are rolling your eyes a little bit. I mean, does this guy really need to make the case for facts and some form of objective reality? But honestly, these days, it feels like an argument that needs to be made. What makes these theories that I'm looking at today so interesting is that they cast some serious shade on the traditional physical and documentary evidence that are used to prove things about the ancient and medieval periods. What if all the documents were forged? Like every single one? What if all the artifacts in architecture had been grossly misdated? What if hundreds of years of history never actually took place and what we thought of as history was little more than a phantom timeline? Well, let's dive into these theories and see what we can discover. The phantom time hypothesis comes to us from two German thinkers, Herbert Illig and Dr. Hans Ulrich Niemitz. Illig first proposed this theory in 1991 after puzzling over what he saw as some very strange anomalies in the historical record. In his estimation, there was something very fishy about the 300-year period between 600 and 900 AD. Now, to be fair, this period of European history is notoriously patchy when it comes to historical sources. It's so bad, in fact, that for a long time it was rather unflatteringly called the Dark Ages. Now, more recently, many medievalists have challenged this characterization, asking things like, how dark were the Dark Ages, really? But even those who challenge the idea of a quote-unquote Dark Age still have to admit that reliable sources from the early medieval period are considerably less abundant than from other historical eras. But what caught Illig and Niemitz's attention were what they saw as weird anachronisms in the architecture from this period. You see, they believed that the few notable pieces of European architecture from the years 600 to 900 were actually built in another era. They say that the churches and castles that have been traditionally dated to this era all feature architectural techniques either from a much earlier or a much later period in history. Niemitz's favorite example of this is the Chapel of Aachen in Germany. Now, the widely accepted view of this chapel was that it was originally part of Charlemagne's much larger palace. And it's a very cool-looking building. The vaulted ceiling and the rising arches are indeed very impressive for medieval architecture. So impressive, in fact, that Niemitz concludes that it couldn't have possibly been finished in 805, as is commonly accepted. He tells us that the chapel, quote, seems to come approximately 200 years too early. The way of constructing an arch shown in this chapel has no predecessor. Arched aisles are usual only in the 11th century. End quote. It's an interesting point. Even historians of architecture have commented on the specialness of the buildings from Charlemagne's era. Now, the traditional explanation is that the stability brought by Charlemagne's reign and the emperor's patronage of education, the arts, and engineering led to a flowering in culture known as the Carolingian Renaissance. One of the fruits of this cultural moment was some very cool architecture. But Illig and Niemitz are not convinced. For them, the fact that buildings like the Aachen Chapel have no immediate predecessors and have no notable successors for like 200 years seems suspicious. The Carolingian Renaissance seems to pop out of nowhere and then seems to disappear without a trace. Figuratively speaking, it seems to have no mother and no children. So, what's going on here? Well, this is where Illig smells a conspiracy. He proposes that the reason that the Carolingian Renaissance seems so bizarre is because it never actually happened. Charlemagne is a fictional character, and the years of his reign fall smack dab in the middle of what he calls phantom time. All of the cool stuff attributed to Charlemagne was actually from the 11th century. So Illig speculates that something must have gone down in the 11th century that messed with the timeline. He lays the blame at the feet of Holy Roman Emperor Otto III. Okay, so who's this guy and why did he want to invent a fake past? Well, Otto III was the king of Germany, whose reign is traditionally dated from the years 983 to 1002 AD. Otto had inherited a huge European empire that encompasses most of today's Central European nations and much of northern Italy. Otto's reign was characterized by him reasserting the dominance of his empire over Rome. He even handpicked a couple of popes. He also reclaimed the prestigious title of Holy Roman Emperor after the post had remained dormant for a number of years. Now, Illig speculates that in Otto's quest to legitimize his claim to the title Holy Roman Emperor, he cooked up a fake ancestor. This fake ancestor would be a heroic conqueror who had basically invented European culture, and he would be the first person to hold the title Holy Roman Emperor. That fake ancestor was none other than Charlemagne. Illig goes on to hypothesize that to make his reign seem even more super special, Otto III monkeyed with the date. It's Illig's contention that Otto III actually lived sometime around 700 AD, but he needed to alter the timeline to allow room for his fake ancestor. He also wanted to place himself at the very special seeming year of 1000 AD. Since Otto had handpicked the Pope, one Sylvester II, the Catholic Church happily obliged the emperor's request, and roughly 300 years were added to the date. Illig speculates that because the AD-BC system of dating was still somewhat new, Otto was able to make the change without anyone really noticing, because no one was really using the AD system of dates anyway. From then on in, chroniclers and historians were faced with a weird 300-year gap in the historical record. To fill in this gap, they took Otto's lead and fleshed out Charlemagne's backstory, while also creating a neat timeline that leads directly to Otto. The result was the phantom timeline of events that placed Otto III right in the middle of the very special year of 1000 AD. For Illig and Niemitz, the ultimate proof for the phantom time hypothesis has to do with a weird inconsistency in the Gregorian calendar. Now, this is going to get mathy, so I'm going to go slow. So back in 1582, Pope Gregory XIII had a team of experts make some slight tweaks to the calendar so it was more precise. Europeans had been using a calendar that had been introduced by Julius Caesar way back in 45 BC. Now, Caesar's calendar was pretty good, especially for its time, but it had miscalculated the length of the solar year by 0.002%. Now, this might seem tiny, but over time, this small discrepancy can lead to a drift in the calendar. If the drift persists, eventually your months no longer line up with the seasons. In the Northern Hemisphere, you could have winter starting in March or something bananas like that. So, in 1582, astronomers and mathematicians concluded that because of the small imperfection in the Julian calendar, the calendar had drifted 10 days from where it should have been. So when the new calendar was created, the clock was then set forward by 10 days. Now, Niemitz and Illig make a big deal out of this 10-day correction because the math shows that a 10-day drift would occur over 1,257 years. So if Easter was in the right spot in the year 1 AD, then you would have a 10-day discrepancy by the year 1257, not by the year 1582. Does that make sense? What they're claiming is that when the Gregorian calendar came into usage, it wasn't 1582, it was actually 1257. If it was actually 1582, then mathematically, the calendar should have been out of whack by 13 days. The fact that it was only off by 10 proves that phantom time had been added to the chronology. How much phantom time? Well, if you subtract 1257 from 1582, you get 325. Yes, these are the phantom 300 years that were invented by Otto III. So, this is a very interesting argument, but turns out it's actually super easy to debunk. You see, Illig and Niemitz made a very foolish little error. They assumed that in 1582, the Julian calendar had been calibrated to the year 1. If there was no phantom time, then that means that the calendar must have been introduced in 325, which Niemitz shrugs off by saying, quote, "It seems unbelievably that Caesar introduced his calendar in 325 AD. This is unbelievable because by then he'd already been dead for more than 300 years." End quote. But here's what old Niemitz is forgetting. The year 325 AD is actually super significant. You see, 325 is when the Council of Nicaea went down. This was that very famous and incredibly important church council convened by the Emperor Constantine the Great that basically set what would be considered Orthodox Christian doctrine for centuries. Among the many things that were debated at the council, one of them was the proper date for Easter. From then on in, all future systems of dating in the Christian world used the Nicene dates. Put simply, the calendar was reset in the year 325. So the math actually works perfectly for there to have been a drift of 10 days by 1582. In short, there is no gap in the chronology. But on top of that, there are tons of other problems with the idea of phantom time. First of all, if Otto III was actually living around 700 AD, then nothing about his life makes sense. The 300 years that Illig and Niemitz claim were made up were the years that the empire that Otto inherited was created. So, if everything post-Otto is real history, then Europe transforms weirdly and rapidly right around 700 AD. Where does the Holy Roman Empire come from in this theory? Well, it supposes that Otto III cobbled it together himself through conquest. But if that's true, then why would he not take credit for that achievement? Why make up a fake ancestor and make him the founder of the empire that you yourself created? You could argue that it maybe makes you seem more legitimate to future generations, but I don't know, that seems like a bit of a stretch. Also, it would require the complete rewriting of your own life story. All that time spent conquering would need to be filled in with other, noticeably less impressive stuff. To think that Otto had the chroniclers make him sound slightly less awesome for the purpose of creating a heroic ancestor just doesn't pass the smell test. The other major critique of this theory is that it's deeply Eurocentric. Basically, it only really makes sense if you just consider European history. To be fair, the Carolingian Renaissance is kind of a bizarre historical anomaly. But that wasn't the only thing going on in the world in the years between 600 and 900 AD. In fact, for many cultures outside of Europe, these centuries are actually some of the most significant ever. The obvious example comes to us from the Middle East. What was going on in the years 600 to 900 in that part of the world? Turns out it was the birth of Islam. From an Islamic perspective, these years are like super important. These were the years when the Prophet Muhammad lived, the first Quran was written, and the armies of Islam burst out of the Arabian Peninsula and proceeded to conquer much of the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain. One of the world's most significant religions was created and managed to spread across 3 continents in these centuries. For the followers of Islam, these are like the most important years in history. If you try to explain the rise of Islam while taking 300 years out of our current chronology, then the whole thing really stops making sense. You know what else was happening in those years? China was going through one of its many periods of territorial expansion and cultural growth. These were the years of the so-called Tang Dynasty, which produced one of the longest periods of stability and prosperity in China's history. In these years, China went through a massive building phase that saw the construction of many of the country's great cities. Some historians have even called the Tang Dynasty, quote, a golden age of cosmopolitan culture. Now, to be fair to the proponents of phantom time, the definitive history of the Tang Dynasty wasn't written until the year 945 AD. But for the Chinese chroniclers to also be in on Otto III's conspiracy and to invent their own phantom time fiction, that just strains credulity. You know what else was happening in those years? The Pala Empire in northeast India was going through their own golden age. They were building elaborate Buddhist temples and founding universities. You know what else was going on in those years? The Mayan civilization was reaching the peak of its classical period. All of this is to say that for the rest of the world, there was a lot going on in those years. So, the phantom time hypothesis may have an extremely cool name, but it doesn't really make sense. It's a theory that's basically based on a math error and completely falls apart as soon as you consider the history of the world outside of Europe. Interestingly enough, while the phantom time hypothesis is based on a very straightforward bit of math, the other theory about falsified history is built on an extremely complex mathematical formula. It's so complex, in fact, that it took a bona fide mathematician to come up with it. So let's take a minute and explore the weird world of the new chronology. The new chronology is a theory developed by the Russian mathematician Anatoly Fomenko, but it has its roots in some earlier thinkers. You see, back in 1696, the French librarian Jean Hardouin became convinced that many of the texts from classical antiquity had actually been forged by Benedictine monks in the 13th and 14th centuries. Hardouin had been creating his own translation of Pliny the Elder's Natural History, a classic. But in the course of his research, he had become dismayed by the fact that all of the existing versions of classical texts had been copies created in the medieval period. He also became suspicious of many of these sources and started to believe that most of Europe's classical past had simply been invented by these monks. Hardouin had promised a blockbuster piece of evidence after he died, but unfortunately, there was nothing in his personal papers to support any of this. So, even though Hardouin was never able to substantiate his suspicions, the seed of doubt that he planted in the 1600s would eventually grow into a gnarled and twisted bramble of pseudo-history. His ideas would eventually be explored by the Russian thinker Nikolai Morozov, who in turn would influence our man, Anatoly Fomenko. You see, Fomenko would take these theories and apply his own mathematical analysis of kings lists, zodiacs, and astronomical data to create a radically different chronology of world history. The conclusions he comes to are pretty far out. In his 7-volume opus, History, Fiction, or Science, Fomenko lays out his mathematical analysis of history and makes a number of pretty wild proposals. Firstly, Fomenko contends that the written historical record can only be conclusively dated back as far as 800 AD, and that almost nothing is known about the years between 800 and 1000. So, he proposes that the history of human civilization pretty much starts in 800 AD. Perhaps there were a few centuries before 800 when we were building things but not keeping written records. But the conventional idea that human civilization stretches back thousands of years, he says, is fundamentally false. For Anatoly Fomenko, the quote-unquote real human history stretches back only about 1,200 years. So he's basically the opposite of our old buddy Graham Hancock. Hancock proposes that human civilization is thousands of years older than is commonly accepted. Fomenko says it's thousands of years younger. So how does this theory work? Well, Fomenko proposes that what we know as classical and medieval history is in fact a series of, quote, phantom reflections of the true timeline. You see, he doesn't say that thousands of years of history were simply invented. Instead, he proposes that around 300 years of real events did take place in the period that we think of as the medieval era. Then, these events were basically copied and pasted dozens of times by chroniclers and historians to pad out the timeline. So it works like this. There are 300 years of real things. Then a chronicler or a historian wanting to make Europe's history look longer takes those events and then places them 300 years further in the past than they rightfully belong. He changes the names of the principal figures, mushes around some of the events, and boom, you've got 300 new years of history. He then repeats this process again and again and again until we have our current chronology stretching back many thousands of years. So, in other words, the old adage that history repeats itself, in this case, is literally true. Fomenko supports these claims with mathematical calculations. Now, I can't pretend that I understand Fomenko's math at all. My attempts to explain it are going to inevitably fall short, but here's the gist. Fomenko tells us that if you do a mathematical comparison between the reigns of the kings in early Europe with the reigns of the Byzantine emperors from the late medieval period, i.e., the true timeline, then you realize that they correlate. All right, follow me so far? To grossly simplify this whole thing, it would basically be like if you took a list of all the English kings and you put them beside a list of all the late medieval Byzantine emperors. What you would see is all those early kings had the same duration of reign as their corresponding emperor. They match up. They would look exactly alike. Confusing, I know. But Fomenko sees this as evidence that the true events, which were happening in the Byzantine Empire in the late medieval period, have just been pasted onto the past of other nations. Are you still following? Okay. If it's not crazy enough for you yet, let's try this one on for size. Fomenko goes on to suggest that the Western Roman Empire didn't really exist. The word Rome, he says, is a placeholder for any significant city. So, in his estimation, there were actually 3 eras of Romes. The first was Alexandria in Egypt. The second and most important Rome was in Constantinople. He also thinks that Constantinople stands in as the biblical Jerusalem. For him, the Temple of Solomon is just a phantom reflection of the great Byzantine cathedral of the Hagia Sophia. Furthermore, he proposes that the story of Jesus Christ is basically just a mythical mashup of a number of different traditions. He claims that the figure from the, quote, real history that inspired the Jesus story was actually Byzantine Emperor Andronikos Komnenos. So, according to Fomenko, the historical Jesus was born sometime around 1152 AD and was crucified on a hill in Constantinople around 1185 AD. Now, the third Rome, Fomenko theorizes, could have been a handful of different cities. Constantinople, Rome in Italy, and interestingly, Moscow. So this brings us to the most fascinating part of Fomenko's theory, and what I think actually illuminates the goal of his entire project. You see, the fact that Moscow is the third Rome is no accident. Fomenko claims that one of the consequences of the fake, overly long chronology that's been commonly accepted is that it has robbed Russia of its correct place in history. He contends that for most of the medieval period, Russia enjoyed a high level of political and cultural dominance in both Europe and Asia. All the steppe nomadic peoples like the Huns, the Mongols, the Scythians, the Goths were actually all part of a united group of people he calls the Russian Horde. He rejects the idea that the Russians were ever under the thumb of the Mongols descended from Genghis Khan. On the contrary, the Russians were the Mongols. All of those great conquests should be attributed to the Russian Horde. Now, all of this helps Fomenko justify why this fake chronology was created in the first place. Because, honestly, that's a real puzzler. I mean, what's the point of inventing thousands of years of human history? Not only that, if you're going to invent this fake past, why go through the convoluted process of creating phantom reflections? Well, the assertion is that this was done by Western Europeans starting in the late Middle Ages and continuing into the modern period. They created this fake chronology to bolster the history and legitimacy of their own nations while undermining the rightful heritage of Russia. This is why Fomenko chose to have an image of Christ crucified to Big Ben as the cover art for his book. This is his not-so-subtle jab at the English. You see, it was the English who took this version of history and exported it around the world during the height of their colonial dominance. Western Europeans invented a cool-sounding Western Roman Empire and long lists of French, English, and Spanish kings. In this fake chronology, Russia was humiliated by being relegated to a bit part in the story. To add insult to injury, these historians even had the gall to suggest that Russia had once been conquered by the Mongols. You see, this is the most fascinating thing about the new chronology. On the surface, it seems to be all about the complex mathematical formulas. But at its heart, it's really all about Russian pride. Now, to be fair, there is a legitimate critique to be made of the Western historical canon. It's true that the history of Western Europe, and by extension Anglo-America, has been privileged in both the writing and the teaching of history. This view of history was also exported to the rest of the world through the process of colonialism. So, it is completely justified to examine Western history with a critical eye and ask whose stories are being told and whose are being left out. Indeed, you could make a very strong argument that Russian history, especially early Russian history, has been largely ignored by the Western historical tradition. However, to argue that thousands of years of world history were invented just to stick it to the Russians, that's a much harder pill to swallow. So, how do we know that the new chronology is bogus? Well, first and foremost, there is just common sense. Fomenko does a very good job of beguiling his reader, sucking them into the intricacies of his mathematics, and breaking their brain with the complexities of his criticism of the traditional chronology. But think about it. If human history is only 1,300 years long, then that means we would have had to have built, and then in some cases knocked down, what looks like thousands of years worth of stuff. I mean, can you really accept the idea that the pyramids were built only 1,300 years ago? Then a few years later, the Parthenon was built and the Colosseum was built like the next day, and then every medieval castle in Europe was built like right after that? I mean, it just boggles the mind. And think about the history of art. The reliefs on the walls of Mesopotamian cities would become basically contemporary with medieval painting. Secondly, the entire discipline of archaeology would make no sense whatsoever if the new chronology was real. Let's take, for example, one of my favorite archaeological sites, the city of Troy in Hisarlik, Turkey. As we spoke about at length in the Trojan War episodes, there's physical evidence that there were at least 9 different cities that existed on that site over the centuries. So, for just that one archaeological site to make sense in the new chronology, that means that those 9 distinct cities, each with their own unique architecture and layout, were built and destroyed within a hot 300-year period. That would mean that each of those cities only really got to flourish or exist for about 30 years before it was destroyed and replaced by another city. Guys, that just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. Forget carbon dating. That doesn't even make sense when it comes to the accumulation of dirt. And that is just one of literally thousands of examples. Now, I'm not saying that the discipline of archaeology is above criticism, but to write off pretty much every single archaeological discovery as false, I'm just not ready to believe that. But speaking of carbon dating, That is the scientific tool that ultimately makes the argument against the new chronology. Carbon dating has allowed us to date historical artifacts with a relatively high degree of accuracy. For those of you that don't know, carbon dating works by analyzing how much the radioactive carbon-14 isotope has decayed in an object. Because this decay rate is consistent, scientists are able to make pretty strong guesses about how long things have been around. What do you know? Carbon dating suggests that human civilization is thousands of years old. Using this science, we've learned that the oldest known temples built by human beings, which are at the Göbekli Tepe site in Turkey, date back 10,000 years. The findings of carbon dating have also been supported by the other major scientific dating technique, which is known as dendrochronology. This is basically the science of counting the rings on tree stumps. As many of you might remember from when you were kids, the age of a tree can be determined by counting the rings. The same is true about wooden objects. Using the techniques of dendrochronology, we've been able to date wooden objects back thousands of years. And you want to know where the oldest wooden object made by human hands has been found? In a nice bit of irony, it's Russia. Yes, a small ceremonial wooden staff from Russia has been dated to 11,000 years ago. But according to the new chronology, the Russian horde probably whittled that object sometime around 700 AD. Now, both carbon dating and dendrochronology are not without their skeptics. And as you might imagine, Anatoly Fomenko is chief among them. And much like the math he uses to support the new chronology, his criticism of these tools are complex, difficult to follow, and ultimately distract from the more obviously ridiculous parts of his theory. Put simply, if you're going to accept the new chronology, you have to reject the science behind carbon dating and dendrochronology. Now, you're free to do your own research into these complex sciences and draw your own conclusions about whether or not they can be trusted. As for me, I'm satisfied that these tools are at least accurate enough to prove that human civilization is more than 1,300 years old. So, the new chronology, much like the phantom time hypothesis, doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. Nevertheless, its complexity remains seductive. The fact that Fomenko supports his claims with head-spinning mathematics can make it hard to criticize. If Anatoly Fomenko or one of his fans wanted to challenge my take on the new chronology, all they would have to do would be to ask me to explain why his math was wrong. I wouldn't be able to do it. The man is a mathematician, and I'm sure his calculations are internally consistent. It's just that everything else about his theory doesn't fit with my own experience of the world. I also find the political motivations behind his work to be kinda obvious. The undertones of Russian nationalism that course through the theory really can't be ignored. In the end, theories like the phantom time hypothesis and the new chronology are fun as thought experiments, but they can be dangerous as ways to understand history. I do truly believe that we should question everything. It's important to ask, how do we know what we know? Have we been the unwitting victims of a terrible fraud? However, what can sometimes happen in our quest for the truth is that we can become extremely skeptical of established ideas while not holding fringe ideas to the same rigorous standards. I'm all for railing against the establishment. You can't spend your teenage years going to punk shows without getting at least a little bit of that in you. But that instinct to question authority shouldn't then make us vulnerable to charlatans, even if those charlatans know how to do some very fancy math. Our ability to think critically can keep us from mistakenly believing that our history is just our fake history. Okay, that's all for this week. Thanks again for listening. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when we'll look at another historical myth. But before we go this week, I need to give a big shout out to all you Patreon people that sent me really awesome suggestions for the new extra episode that's coming out. So there was a weird theme in the suggestions. You guys all seem to want the historical bad boys. So if you go to the Patreon site now, you can vote on 5 potential topics for the upcoming extra episode. And they are Blackbeard, Vlad the Impaler, Caligula, Pancho Villa, and Tesla. So it turns out Tesla's kind of the outlier. I don't know if he counts as a bad boy, but the rest of them totally do. So if you go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory and you're a patron, you can, if you've signed up for $1 or more on Patreon, you can vote on what you want the next extra episode to be. Everyone on Patreon will be getting that episode at no extra charge. So if you want in on that, you got to sign up for Patreon. Otherwise, you are going to have to buy it separately. And if you want to vote on it, you got to be a patron. Before we go this week, I want to give a special shout out to those of you who are supporting at the $5 or more level. You are Robert Kalal, Valerie Croft, Stefan, Juan Carlos Alfaro, Brittany Cutler, Luke Morefoot, Byron Vasquez, Zach Krivner, Cicely Suarez, Sean Brightback, Nicole Motion, Ryan McCormick, Sebastian Svensson, Clodius Maximus, Preston P., Sean Kennedy, Douglas Van Onda, David Knight, Richard Boggs, Kamjeet Gill, Eric England, Connor Evans, and Glenn Saltos. Okay, I know that was a ton of names, but honestly, I have to honor these people because they are the beautiful souls who are deciding to support this show and keep it viable. You guys helped push us over our very first Patreon goal, so I am forever grateful. I can't wait to get you guys the extra episode that you vote on. All right, I think that's enough jibba-jabba from me today. In the meantime, if you want to reach me, you can get me at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. You can hit me up on Twitter at ourfakehistory, or you can go to the Facebook page at facebook.com/ourfakehistory and follow along there. The theme music for the show comes to us from Dirty Church. You can check them out at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. And all the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.